Some families are built on love, others on lies, and mine turned out to be the latter. What started as a simple phone call about my grandfather's estate became the moment I discovered just how far some people will go to steal what isn't theirs. My name is Emma Thompson, and this is the story of how my stepmom tried to erase me from my own family, only to have it backfire in the most spectacular way possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Cedar Falls, Iowa, I learned that family meant everything. The Thompson name carried weight in our small town, not because we were wealthy or famous, but because we were the kind of people who showed up when others needed us most. My grandfather, William Thompson, embodied that spirit more than anyone I knew. Bill, as everyone called him, was the cornerstone of our family, a man whose calloused hands told stories of 4 generations of farming and whose gentle voice could calm any storm. The old farmhouse on Maple Ridge Road had been our family's sanctuary for over a century. Those 200 acres weren't just land to us, they were our heritage, our identity, and our future all rolled into one. Every summer of my childhood was spent there, learning from Grandpa Bill how to restore antique furniture in his workshop, how to read the weather by watching the way the corn swayed, most importantly how to treat people with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. When I turned 18 and left for nursing school, Grandpa Bill pulled me aside on the front porch where we'd shared countless conversations over sweet tea and homemade cookies. "Emma," he said, his weathered hand resting on my shoulder, "this land has been in our family since 1924. Someday, when I'm no longer here, I want you to remember that you're not just a Thompson by name, you're a Thompson by heart. Promise me you'll never forget where you came from, no matter how far your career takes you." I made that promise with tears in my eyes, never imagining how prophetic those words would become. After graduating with my nursing degree, I found my calling in pediatric care at the Children's Hospital in Des Moines. The work was demanding, often requiring me to stay overnight during critical cases. But knowing I was making a difference in young lives made every exhausting shift worthwhile. Those kids needed someone who would fight for them, someone who wouldn't give up when things got tough, and I discovered that caring for others was where my heart truly belonged. During my second year at the hospital, Dad called with news that would change everything. He'd met someone special, a woman named Jennifer, who worked at the bank in town. Their courtship was swift, and within 8 months, they were married in a small ceremony at the courthouse. I was scheduled to work that weekend, covering for a colleague whose own father was in the hospital, so I missed the wedding. At the time, it seemed like just another sacrifice that came with my chosen profession. But looking back, I realized it was the first sign of how my dedication to helping others would be used against me. Jennifer seemed pleasant enough during our first few meetings. She was polished and articulate, with perfectly styled blonde hair and an infectious laugh that seemed to charm everyone she met. She complimented my career choice and expressed admiration for my dedication to sick children. She even mentioned how proud she was to be joining such a caring family. Her words felt genuine. I was genuinely happy that Dad had found companionship after years of loneliness following Mom's death. When I was 16, what I didn't notice initially were the subtle ways Jennifer began inserting herself into family decisions. She started accompanying Dad to family gatherings, which was natural enough. But she also began speaking for him in conversations and gradually steering discussions toward topics that centered around her opinions and preferences. When Grandpa Bill's health began declining, Jennifer was always there with suggestions about care facilities and medical treatments, presenting herself as the voice of reason while positioning my hospital schedule as an obstacle to proper family involvement. The demands of my job meant I was working 60-hour weeks, sometimes more during flu season or when we had multiple critical cases. I'd call Grandpa Bill every few days, but our conversations became shorter as his condition worsened. Jennifer would often answer the phone, explaining that he was resting or having a difficult day, but she always assured me that she and Dad were handling everything. I trusted her updates, grateful that someone was there to help coordinate his care while I was saving lives at the hospital. When Grandpa Bill passed away last spring, I was in the middle of a 72-hour shift treating a 6-year-old girl with pneumonia who had taken a turn for the worse. I couldn't leave her bedside. knowing that my experience and presence might be the difference between life and death for this child. I missed his funeral, a decision that haunted me, but one I knew Grandpa Bill would have understood. He'd always taught me that helping others was the highest calling, and I believed he would have wanted me to save that little girl's life rather than attend his burial. The months following his death were a blur of grief and guilt. I threw myself deeper into work, finding solace in the routine of caring for patients and the satisfaction of making a difference in their recovery. I assumed that Dad and Jennifer were handling the estate matters, and honestly, I was too emotionally drained to involve myself in the details. This was exactly the opening Jennifer had been waiting for, though I wouldn't realize it until much later. Looking back now, I can see that Jennifer's campaign to erase me from my own family began almost immediately after Grandpa Bill's funeral. At the time, though, her actions seemed caring and reasonable, the natural response of a new family member trying to help during a difficult period. She had a talent for wrapping manipulation in kindness, making her most calculated moves appear selfless and loving. The first hint came during a phone call about 3 weeks after the funeral. I had finally gotten 2 days off in a row and called Dad to arrange a visit to the farm. I needed to walk through Grandpa Bill's workshop, to sit in his favorite chair, to feel close to him again. When Jennifer answered the phone, her voice carried a tone I hadn't heard before, slightly strained and overly cheerful. "Emma, sweetie," she said, dragging out the words like honey, "I'm so glad you called. Your father and I have been talking about you constantly. We're worried about how hard you're working, how you're not taking care of yourself. Maybe it's better if you focus on your career right now, instead of worrying about family obligations. We don't want to add to your stress." The conversation felt strange, like she was simultaneously expressing concern while discouraging me from coming home. When I pressed to speak with Dad, she explained that he was napping and that she'd have him call me back later. He never did. When I tried calling the next day, she mentioned that he'd been having some health issues and the doctor had prescribed rest. The way she delivered this information felt rehearsed, too smooth, like she'd prepared the explanation in advance. Strategy became clearer during the few family interactions I managed to attend over the following months. She had an uncanny ability to redirect conversations away from topics that might involve me while positioning herself as the family's primary decision-maker. At my cousin Tyler's graduation party, she spent the entire evening discussing plans for various family events and property maintenance, speaking as if she'd been part of the Thompson family for decades rather than just a few years. When relatives asked about my absence from recent gatherings, Jennifer would shake her head sympathetically and explain how my career had become all-consuming. She'd mention how I'd missed Grandpa Bill's funeral, how I rarely called anymore, how I seemed to have lost interest in family matters. She delivered these observations with a concerned expression, as if she were worried about my well-being rather than systematically undermining my relationships with people who'd known me since childhood. The most unsettling incident occurred during a surprise visit I made to the farm in early summer. I'd gotten off work early and decided to drive out without calling ahead, something I'd done countless times throughout my life. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed several cars I didn't recognize parked near the house. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The most unsettling moment came during a brief phone call in early December. I'd called to wish Dad a happy birthday, but Jennifer answered and explained that he was resting after a busy day. When I asked what had made his day so busy, she hesitated. Before mentioning that they'd had several visitors, people asking questions about the farm and family matters, the way she said it felt evasive, as if she were choosing her words carefully. When I pressed for more details, Jennifer's voice took on a slightly defensive tone. She explained that since I was so busy with work, various family friends and neighbors had been coming to her and Dad with questions about Grandpa Bill's estate and the farm's future. She made it sound like my absence had created a vacuum that she was helpfully filling, but something about the explanation didn't sit right with me. I asked to speak with Dad directly, but Jennifer said he'd already gone to bed and that she'd have him call me back the next day. The promised return call never came. When I tried calling again 2 days later, Jennifer mentioned that Dad wasn't feeling well and that she was trying to limit his stress by handling most family communications herself. This arrangement struck me as odd, but I was in the middle of caring for a critically ill 7-year-old and couldn't focus on family dynamics. The holiday season brought an unusual quiet to my communications with home. Jennifer's regular text updates became less frequent, and when they did arrive, they were shorter and less detailed. Instead of her usual cheerful reports about farm activities and Dad's health, she'd send brief messages like, "Everything fine here. Hope you're well," or Dad says hello, staying warm. The change felt significant, but I attributed it to the natural busyness of the season rather than anything more troubling. Christmas passed without my usual visit home. We had an outbreak of respiratory illness in the pediatric ward that required all hands on deck, and I spent the holiday working 16-hour shifts. I managed a quick phone call to Dad on Christmas morning, but Jennifer answered and explained that he was dealing with a slight cold and didn't want to risk spreading it over the phone. She assured me that they'd had a quiet, pleasant holiday, and that I shouldn't worry about missing it. The new year brought a subtle shift in Jennifer's communications that I almost missed entirely. Her messages began including phrases like, "Your father and I have decided, or we've been thinking about what's best for everyone." These statements felt presumptuous, as if she were positioning herself as an equal partner in family decisions that had traditionally involved broader discussion. When I mentioned this observation to my colleague Sarah during a break, she pointed out that Jennifer was probably just trying to support Dad during a difficult time adjusting to life without Grandpa Bill. The most troubling incident occurred during a phone call in late January. I'd been trying to reach Dad for several days without success, and when Jennifer finally answered, she sounded irritated rather than her usual cheerful self. She mentioned that Dad was having some health issues that required rest and minimal stress, but when I offered to take time off work to help care for him, she quickly declined. "Emma," she said, and there was something sharp in her voice that I'd never heard before, "you have your own life now. You can't just drop everything and come running home every time there's a minor issue. Your father and I are perfectly capable of managing things here. Maybe it's time you focused on your career and let us handle family matters." The conversation ended abruptly, leaving me staring at my phone in confusion. Something fundamental had shifted in Jennifer's attitude toward me, but I couldn't identify exactly what or why. Her words echoed in my mind for days, particularly the phrase, "your own life now," which seemed to suggest that I'd somehow separated myself from the family rather than simply pursuing my career. As winter deepened, I found myself wondering if I'd somehow failed my family without realizing it. The distance that had developed felt natural given my work demands, but Jennifer's recent comments suggested that others might view my absence differently. I began questioning whether my dedication to my patients had come at the expense of my relationships with the people who mattered most. The breaking point came on a frigid February morning when I was finally granted a long weekend off after working 18 consecutive days. 3 children had been discharged successfully. The ward was experiencing an unusual lull that allowed me to actually leave the hospital for more than a few hours. I decided to surprise Dad with an unannounced visit, something I hadn't done in months due to the demanding schedule and Jennifer's subtle discouragement of spontaneous trips. The drive to Cedar Falls felt different that morning. The familiar countryside seemed somehow foreign, as if I were viewing it through different eyes. The snow-covered fields and bare trees that had once felt like home now felt like a landscape I was passing through rather than returning to. I attributed this strange sensation to exhaustion and the stress of recent months. But looking back, I think some part of me sensed that I was driving toward a confrontation that would change everything. When I pulled into the farmhouse driveway, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. The property had an abandoned feel to it, with snow piled high against the workshop door and no tire tracks leading to the main house. The mailbox was overflowing with accumulated correspondence, and several newspapers lay scattered across the front porch, soggy and yellowed from days of exposure to the elements. This level of neglect was completely unlike Dad, who had always maintained the property with meticulous care. I knocked on the front door and waited, hearing no movement from inside. After several minutes, I used my key to enter, calling out Dad's name as I stepped into the entryway. The house felt hollow and cold, with a staleness in the air that suggested it had been empty for some time. The living room furniture was covered with sheets, and there was a thin layer of dust on surfaces that should have been cleaned regularly. My heart began racing as I searched through the house, finding no signs of recent occupation. Dad's bedroom looked like it hadn't been slept in for weeks, and the kitchen contained only expired food items and empty cabinets. The basement workshop, where Grandpa Bill had spent countless hours restoring antique furniture, was completely empty. Every tool, every piece of equipment, every project he'd been working on had vanished without a trace. I called Dad's cell phone repeatedly, but each call went straight to voicemail. I tried Jennifer's number next, and after several rings, she answered with a tone that was decidedly unwelcoming. "Emma," she said, and I could hear background noise that sounded like traffic or a busy restaurant. "What are you doing calling so early? Is something wrong?" I explained that I was at the farmhouse and couldn't find Dad anywhere. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long before Jennifer responded with what sounded like carefully prepared words. "Oh, sweetie," she said, and there was something condescending in her voice that I'd never heard before. "Didn't your father tell you? We've moved to Florida, temporarily. His doctor recommended a warmer climate for his health issues. We're staying with my sister in Tampa while we look for a permanent place." The news hit me like a physical blow. Dad had never mentioned health, issues serious enough to require relocation, and Jennifer had never mentioned having a sister in Florida. The fact that such a major life change had occurred without any discussion or notification felt impossible to process. When I asked why no one had told me about this decision, Jennifer's response was swift and brutal. "Emma," she said, and her voice carried a coldness that made my blood freeze. "We tried to include you in family decisions for months, but you made it clear that your career was more important than family obligations. You missed your grandfather's funeral. You never visit. You barely call. Why would we disrupt your busy schedule with details about our living arrangements?" Her words were calculated to hurt, and they succeeded completely. Each accusation felt like a knife twisted in an old wound, playing on guilt I'd carried for months about balancing work and family. But beyond the pain, I felt a growing anger at the unfairness of her characterization. I'd missed family events because I was saving children's lives, not because I didn't care about my family. The conversation deteriorated quickly from there. Jennifer's mask of friendly concern finally slipped completely, revealing a womanhood apparently been harboring resentment and ambition for far longer than I'd realized. She told me that I'd never really been part of the family anyway, and my dedication to work was just an excuse to avoid real responsibility, and that Dad was finally learning to depend on people who actually cared about him. The cruelest moment came when she said, in a voice dripping with false sympathy, "You don't belong in this family, Emma. You never did. You've spent so much time building your career in the city that you've forgotten where you came from. Maybe it's time you accepted that and stopped pretending to care about people you've already abandoned." The words hit me with such force that I actually staggered backward, leaning against the kitchen counter for support. This was the woman who'd married my father, who'd been welcomed into our family, who'd benefited from our hospitality and trust. Now she was telling me that I didn't belong in the very family that had shaped everything I was and everything I valued. I tried to respond, to defend myself against her accusations, but Jennifer cut me off with a laugh that was both triumphant and cruel. "Save it, Emma," she said. "Your father and I have moved on. We're building a new life without the drama and guilt trips. If you really cared about his happiness, you'd leave us alone to enjoy our retirement in peace." The call ended abruptly, leaving me standing in the empty farmhouse with my phone still pressed to my ear. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of wind rattling the windows and the distant hum of the heating system struggling to warm a house that had been effectively abandoned. I spent the next hour walking through the empty rooms, trying to process what had just happened. This was the house where I'd learned to walk, where I'd celebrated countless birthdays and holidays, where I'd received comfort during my mother's illness and death. Now it felt like a mausoleum, a monument to relationships that had apparently died without my knowledge. The workshop was the hardest room to face. Grandpa Bill's tools were gone, but the outlines of their former positions were still visible on the workbenches. The smell of wood stain and varnish lingered faintly in the air, ghost reminders of the countless hours we'd spent together restoring furniture and talking about life. The emptiness felt like a desecration, as if someone had strip-mined my memories and sold them for scrap. I found myself crying for the first time in months, tears of grief and rage and profound confusion. The woman who'd just told me I didn't belong in my own family had somehow convinced my father to abandon the home he'd lived in for over 30 years. She'd orchestrated a move to Florida without consulting me, disposed of family heirlooms without permission, and then had the audacity to blame me for the distance that had developed between us. The drive back to Des Moines was a blur of anger and heartbreak. I kept replaying Jennifer's words, trying to understand how someone could be so deliberately cruel. Her accusation that I'd abandoned my family felt particularly unfair given that I'd been working exhausting hours to help sick children, work that my grandfather had always supported and encouraged. That evening I sat in my apartment staring at my phone, wanting to call someone who could help me make sense of what had happened. But who could I turn to? Dad was apparently in Florida, Uncle Ben lived 3 hours away, and I hadn't maintained close relationships with other family members due to my demanding work schedule. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely alone. The next morning brought a phone call that would change everything. I was getting ready for work when my phone rang, displaying a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was professional and formal, introducing himself as Mr. Davis from the law firm of Henderson, Davis and Associates. "Miss Thompson," he said, "I've been trying to reach you for several weeks regarding your grandfather's estate. There are some important matters we need to discuss as soon as possible. Would you be available to meet with me this afternoon?" The meeting with Mr. Davis that afternoon revealed the most shocking truth of my life. Sitting in his oak-paneled office, I learned that Grandpa Bill had left me everything in his will. The entire 200-acre farm, the antique restoration business, and over $2 million in assets. Jennifer had been lying about Dad's health, manipulating him into signing power of attorney documents, and had planned to sell everything before I discovered the truth. The lawyer explained that Jennifer had been intercepting legal correspondence for months, forging documents, and even filing false claims about my abandonment of the family. She'd convinced Dad that I no longer cared about the farm and had manipulated him into believing that moving to Florida was his idea. The empty farmhouse, the missing tools, the cruel phone call. It was all part of her elaborate scheme to steal my inheritance. Mr. Davis handed me copies of Grandpa Bill's original will, bank statements showing Jennifer's unauthorized withdrawals, and recorded conversations where she'd discussed selling the property behind my back. The evidence was overwhelming. Within hours, we'd filed for emergency injunctions, fraud charges, and complete restoration of the estate to my name. When the sheriff's department contacted Jennifer in Florida, her entire story crumbled. Dad, who'd been isolated and manipulated, broke down in tears when he learned the truth. Jennifer's attempt to erase me from my own family had backfired spectacularly. She now faced criminal charges, complete financial ruin, and the loss of everything she'd tried to steal. The woman who'd told me I didn't belong in my family was the one who truly didn't belong at all. Sometimes the people who try to tear you down only reveal your true strength. I'd learned that fighting for what's right isn't just about winning. It's about proving that some things are worth defending no matter the cost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Through the kitchen window, I could see Jennifer hosting what appeared to be a casual dinner party with several neighbors and acquaintances from town. I walked through the front door, expecting the usual warm welcome I'd always received in that house, but instead found myself facing a room full of people who seemed surprised and slightly uncomfortable to see me. Jennifer recovered quickly, rushing over with an exaggerated smile and a hug that felt more like a performance than genuine affection. "Emma, what a surprise," she announced to the room. "You didn't tell us you were coming. I hope you don't mind that we're having a little gathering. I've been trying to maintain your grandfather's tradition of community hospitality. Oh, I know how busy you are with your own life in the city." The way she emphasized your own life in the city made it sound like I'd abandoned my roots, chosen urban sophistication over family values. Several people in the room nodded sympathetically. I realized that Jennifer had been crafting a narrative about me for months, painting me as the ungrateful granddaughter who'd moved on to bigger and better things. During dinner, Jennifer dominated the conversation, sharing stories about her efforts to preserve family traditions and maintain the property. She spoke about consulting with various local contractors, about necessary repairs, about researching the best ways to honor Grandpa Bill's memory, about the burden of managing such a large estate. Throughout her monologue, she kept glancing at me with an expression that seemed to say, "See how much work this is? See how much I'm doing while you're busy with your career?" When Mrs. Rodriguez, our longtime family friend, asked about my nursing work, Jennifer quickly interjected before I could respond fully. "She's working such long hours, helping all those sick children in the city. It's wonderful work, but it doesn't leave much time for family responsibilities. I keep telling Robert that Emma has built her own life now, and we shouldn't expect her to worry about things here." The conversation continued around me rather than with me, as if I were a topic to be discussed rather than a person sitting at the table. Jennifer had somehow managed to transform my dedication to helping sick children into evidence of my disconnection from family, my professional success into proof of my personal failure. After dinner, when most of the guests had left, I tried to talk with Dad privately. He seemed tired and distracted, more so than I'd ever seen him. When I mentioned wanting to spend more time at the farm, wanting to be more involved in family decisions, he just patted my shoulder and said that Jennifer was handling everything beautifully, and I shouldn't worry myself with such matters. The drive back to Des Moines that night was filled with confusion and growing unease. Something fundamental had shifted in my family dynamics, but I couldn't quite identify what or why. Jennifer's behavior seemed caring on the surface, but underneath felt calculated and excluding. She was systematically repositioning herself as the family's caretaker while casting me as the absent, career-focused granddaughter who'd lost touch with her roots. Over the following weeks, I noticed other subtle changes in how family members interacted with me. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Invitations to family events seemed to come with disclaimers about my busy schedule. When I did attend gatherings, conversations felt stilted and careful, as if everyone were walking on eggshells around me. Jennifer's masterpiece came during a family barbecue in late summer. She'd spent weeks planning the event, sending invitations to extended family members and organizing activities that celebrated Thompson family history. When I arrived, she greeted me with that same artificial warmth, but within minutes, she was explaining to various relatives how difficult it had been to coordinate the event without knowing whether I'd be able to attend. The way she framed my work schedule as unpredictable and my commitment to the family as questionable was masterful in its subtlety. She never directly criticized me, but she painted a picture of someone who'd grown too important for family obligations, someone who needed to be accommodated rather than relied upon. As the evening progressed, I realized that Jennifer had been having similar conversations with family members for months, gradually shifting their perception of me from the dedicated granddaughter who worked hard to help others into the self-absorbed career woman who'd outgrown her family. She'd taken my greatest strength, my commitment to caring for others, and transformed it into my greatest weakness in their eyes. The autumn months brought an unusual intensity to my work at the children's hospital. We were dealing with an early flu season that had hit particularly hard, and our pediatric intensive care unit was operating at full capacity. I found myself pulling double shifts regularly, sometimes sleeping in the on-call room for days at a time rather than making the drive home to my apartment in Des Moines. The work was exhausting but fulfilling, each successful recovery reminding me why I'd chosen this profession in the first place. During this period, I naturally fell into a routine of minimal contact with family. My phone calls to Dad became weekly check-ins rather than daily conversations, and I relied heavily on Jennifer's updates about family matters. She seemed to have everything under control, sending me occasional text messages about Dad's health, the farm's maintenance, and various family happenings. Her messages were always cheerful and reassuring, painting a picture of domestic harmony that allowed me to focus entirely on my patients without guilt. The texts felt caring enough at first. "Your dad is doing great, had his checkup yesterday, and doctor says he's healthy as a horse." Or, "The farm is looking beautiful this fall. Wish you could see the colors, but know you're busy saving lives. These messages created a comfortable distance that I interpreted as thoughtfulness rather than calculation. Jennifer seemed to understand that my work demanded complete attention, and I appreciated what I believed was her effort to shield me from unnecessary worry. What I didn't realize was how these communications were gradually conditioning me to expect less involvement in family decisions. When Jennifer mentioned that she'd hired a local contractor to repair the farmhouse roof, I simply thanked her for handling it. When she told me about organizing a small memorial service for Grandpa Bill's birthday, I felt grateful that someone was honoring his memory, even though I couldn't attend due to work obligations. Each decision she made without consulting me felt reasonable in isolation, but together they were establishing a pattern of exclusion that would become significant later. The hospital work consumed not just my time, but my emotional energy as well. We lost 3 children that November, losses that hit me particularly hard because I'd grown attached to each of them during their extended stays. The grief was overwhelming, and I found myself staying even later at the hospital. Partly because the work demanded it, and partly because the familiar routine of caring for others helped me process my own pain. Home felt like a distant concept, something I'd deal with when life at the hospital calmed down. My apartment in Des Moines became little more than a place to collect mail and change clothes. I developed a pattern of grabbing whatever bills and correspondence had accumulated, stuffing them into my work bag to sort through during quiet moments at the hospital. Most of it was routine medical journals, utility bills, and junk mail that I'd dispose of without much attention. I was living in survival mode, managing only the most essential tasks while pouring everything else into my patients. I managed to call the farm during this period. The conversations felt increasingly strained. Dad's voice sounded distant and tired, as if talking required effort he didn't have. When I'd ask about his health or the farm's condition, he'd give short, vague responses before quickly passing the phone to Jennifer. She'd take over with her usual cheerful updates, but something in her tone had changed. There was a new confidence there, an authority that hadn't existed before. Jennifer began making comments about how hard I was working, how I sounded exhausted, how I really needed to take better care of myself. While these observations seemed caring, they also carried an undertone of criticism, as if my dedication to my patients was somehow excessive or unhealthy. She'd suggest that maybe I should consider requesting lighter shifts or finding a less demanding position. Advice that felt disconnected from my reality and my passion for the work.